We head into panel 1, and I think the topic couldn't be more appropriate for what has actually led to us having a virtual Young Investigator Meeting 2021. So we're going to talk about the impact of the current pandemic on the scientific broader research ecosystem in India and across the world. And we have a set of panelists representing different aspects of this. All right, Rashna Bhandari is going to be the moderator. Rashna, you want to take over from here?
Sure. Thanks, Karishma. It's really a delight to be here at this very special YIM. I think it's going to change the way we do things henceforth, and that may be part of our panel discussion moving forward. And of course, we all can't wait to meet in person, but until then, let's talk about, as Karishma said, why we are meeting online and how this is going to impact our the scientific ecosystem that we are all a part of. I would have liked to introduce Jyotsna right now, but because of the connectivity issues and pandemic restrictions she couldn't join us. So instead, we have Jitu, who's the director of the NCBS, and also, of course, a member of the India Bioscience Board, and was at that dinner table where YIM was born. Shahid Jameel was until very recently the CEO of the Wellcome Trust DBT India Alliance that he served for 7 years. And many of us know him more recently also from his frequent appearances on TV, telling us more about the pandemic and giving us a lot of COVID gyan, which not only the public has been very fortunate to have had him in that role, but many of us researchers also have sort of hung on very closely to what he has shared through various public fora. Sandhya Visweswariah at the Indian Institute of Science is a professor in the Department of Molecular Reproduction, Development and Genetics. And a quick disclaimer here, she is not only Bushra's mentor, she is also mine. I did my PhD with Sandhya, and we continue to have a mentor-mentee and a friend relationship. And I'm very happy to have her on the panel, and I did not have a role in selecting her to be a member of the panel. Ron Vale, along with Jitu, was at the dinner table where YIM was born. Ron was for the very long time at the UCSF and recently moved as director of the Janelia research campus of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. And he's been at almost every YIM, either in person or has sent us a message. And really, we do owe what YIM and India Bioscience is today to Jitu, Ron, Shashi, and others who put the whole concept together. So I'd like to get us just give a quick overview now on what it is that we're going to be talking about for the next hour or so. And we divided this into sort of 4 themes that we thought are important to address in the context of how COVID has impacted us as researchers, especially as young investigators. The first thing, what Jitu will be speaking about is the impact of COVID-19 on changing research directions and priorities. And then we will have Shahid weigh in on the impact of COVID-19 on our research funding. Sandhya will talk about how we can support early career researchers and including YIs, but more importantly, PhD scholars and postdocs who have been the most affected at this time in terms of their career. And Ron will share with us what he believes will be the likely impact of COVID-19 on the global science sort of landscape in terms of our scientific agendas and collaborations as we move forward. We will have some of the panelists weighing in on these topics as well. Each topic will be followed by an audience poll, and that will help you as an audience participate even while we have the panelists speaking. And then later on, we will take live questions from the audience. Type your questions into the box as you were doing after Bushra's talk, and I will then share them with the panel members. So, well, let's just get started. And the first person we'd like to weigh in Jyotsna's place, who agreed at the very last moment to talk about the impact of COVID on changing research priorities and direction. Jitu?
Thanks, Rashna. Also, you know, it's going to be a hard shoes to fill. I mean, Jyotsna has really had a very close perspective on what the impact of COVID has been on various research priorities, especially being at a very active institute in Hyderabad at the CCMB. What I'd like to say is that, give you some perspective from what we have been experiencing on the campus at the National Center for Biological Science, the Institute for Stem Cell and Regenerative Medicine, and at the Center for Cell and Molecular Platforms, which form what is the Bangalore Life Science Cluster, give you a perspective of the kind of research priorities that have been impacted by COVID. So I should say that when the pandemic, came upon us, almost everything that we were doing on the campus, and I think in campuses across the country, came to a grinding halt, unless we could, in fact, put our hand up and convince the institutions at large that we were engaged in what one would call a COVID response. So the institution, that institutions here decided that, first of all, the first things first, we would need to put our hands up to engage with the pandemic in a nuts and bolts manner. The pandemic, the COVID itself was being diagnosed by sort of this incredibly elaborate PCR activity. And many of our institutions, especially the national institutions and some universities as well, said that, let's just put our PCR machines to work. But to put PCR machines to work, you need to have people to put PCR machines to work as well. You need to have people actually engage with diagnostics. Now, this was not a very easy thing. No, scientists are not people who do diagnostics. These are mindsets of, really diametrically opposite intentions. As a person who is engaged in doing science, you ask questions. As somebody who's doing diagnosis, you actually carry out instructions to the last letter. And I must say, that to me was the most interesting part of learning how one could do or should be doing diagnostics. We had to suspend all disbelief and just follow orders. And that took a lot of doing. And I must say, we had to train people who volunteered from our scientific community to engage in the testing facility and build a diagnostic sort of compliant team. And several of our colleagues, in fact, to this day, still don't get it, what diagnostic rigor requires. But we had to do that, and then the state authorities sort of jumped on us and created this opportunity. Now created the possibility for the campus to engage, and now we do about 1,000 tests a day for the state, and that continues. But what this built for us was the capabilities of engaging with a public health problem, of sort of getting really close hand to a medical situation where patient samples and the virus and and its consequences were very upfront and personal, and we built a repository as well. And in fact, now today, from the 50 scientists who work on the campus, research priorities of at least 10 of the scientists have moved towards thinking about engaging with sort of the scope of a direct involvement with public health. And before COVID, I would say that there wasn't that much of an impetus for us to do that. But now, I think there are a number of reasons. And I'm not saying this is I'm not sort of passing judgment on whether this is good or bad. In fact, I'd like to make a certain comment about that. But I think that today, at least, as I said, 10 of 50 of our scientists who hadn't thought about doing this have jumped in and have taken on this as a very serious possibility for work that they will do in the future. So in a sense, COVID has influenced this. Now, I should add there are really prosaic reasons for taking this on. One is funding. Funding was thrown at the COVID problem, and COVID is of course and if you don't have anything else to do, you do some of this work yourself. And I'll give you an example from people in my group who were looking at we look at endocytosis, and of course viruses get into the cell through endocytic processes, and we began to explore how the SARS-CoV-2 gets into the cells and whether we can block its uptake. Clearly interesting biology, very interesting things have come out. And maybe a small group of the colleagues who work with me will eventually go and study some of this in the future. So there, one had to be quick to the draw and get into the act and do something. And and I think that's what's happened. And I think what that has shown is that, deep fundamental science, which is connected to inquiry of a very broad spectrum, can move very quickly to respond to a certain public need. I'm not sure that we should be positioning science in the future as something that just does that, because the reason we are able to do that is because we built a program of being able to take on questions of diverse nature. You don't know where the next calling comes from. Maybe we would need to be doing something about extraterrestrials in order for us to understand what new direction to take. So anyway, I'm going to stop there because I think I've gone on a bit long, and just hear what others have to say in this regard. I mean, as Rashna mentioned, I jumped in at the last minute, so I said what I thought I should say. Thank you.
Thank you, Jitu. I think you did summarize how many of us have had to, quickly adapt our research priorities to make a difference in the pandemic, if I may say so. And it's something that we were already geared to do. We just needed a push to act. So Shantala, can we have the audience poll, please? And if the audience can just cast their votes, I think you have about 30 seconds or so. Have you had to restructure your research or been able to contribute in any other way to fighting the pandemic? Thanks, Shantala. And this is something that we had sort of anticipated. Most of our YI attendees, a majority of them have not had to restructure or change their research direction, and that was to be expected. But a good number, 25%, have been able to contribute in other non-research related ways, and that's alluding to what Jitu was just talking about. And about a quarter have also restructured their research. So I think it would be nice to just take some a quick input now from Sandhya at this moment on what advice she has for those who have not restructured their work, but felt that things were not going as well as they had hoped because they were neither able to restructure or contribute in any other way. So Sandhya, do you have any advice for those our attendees on that? Sandhya, you need to unmute yourself before you start.
Apologies, yes. So, I think as scientists, none of us have not engaged with COVID over the past year. whether it's intellectual or whether we've actually contributed in terms of being able to study the system, develop diagnostics, etc. As scientists, every single one of us has been thinking about the problem. And one of the things that I feel is that if scientists do thinking, they're actually contributing in some way or another. If nothing else, in terms of being able to engage in discussions with others, maybe policymakers, maybe formulating grant calls, etc. So I think if contribution to an area is only in terms of putting people at benches and getting them to work on the problem, I think that's perhaps a narrow perspective, and almost every one of us has learned a lot about viruses, even if we've had nothing to do with viruses in our career. We've learned a lot about the cell biology of these viruses. We've learned a lot about diagnostics. We've learned a lot about vaccines. So all of these things are going to, in some way, impinge upon our thought process as we address our own research questions. So I don't think it's terribly something to feel guilty about if you haven't actively, let's say, benchwork-wise, contributed to understanding the problem. But I do agree with Jitu. In institutions like mine, where we have a very large engineering community whose focus is very, mainly in deliverables, many of them have contributed in terms of developing mobile laboratories to be able to do testing. We also set up a testing center in our institute in the BSL-3 facility. So, there are a lot of people who do engage and are doing something perhaps as worthwhile as anybody could be doing in terms of understanding the disease. But I'm not very sure that one should feel terribly guilty if one hasn't actually worked on the problem at this point of time.
No, I think I totally agree with you, Sandhya. We don't have to restructure our research, but if someone in our families has looked up to us and wants us to interpret all that's on WhatsApp groups about vaccines, for instance, as scientists, we have the authority and the understanding to be able to help people. And I think that itself is our contribution to the pandemic. So moving on, we're just talking about vaccines, and it's time to bring Shahid on. Although in his avatar as being part of the research funding organization is where we want him to weigh on. That is on how the pandemic has impacted our research funding. So Shahid, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rashna. Today's 18th of March, and I recall that, or is it 17th? Today's 17th. We took decision on 17th of March 2020 to close the India Alliance offices because it was becoming very difficult for people to take public transport to reach offices. We were not worried about getting infected in the office. We were getting worried that people will get infected on the way to the office. So it's a sort of an anniversary. But when I look at myself, I transitioned from a funding agency back to an academic environment where I would seek funding. So let me bring that perspective to how COVID has impacted us. So COVID has had implications for researchers in the way they do research, on information structures that researchers and everyone else relies upon. A year ago, you would not think, maybe 2 years ago, you would not think of having a YIM online, but we're having a YIM online. It also affects the funding that researchers seek to carry out their work. But for science, COVID has not been all bad. So let me say what has been good. What has been good is that science is in the spotlight. Science has provided solutions. Science has provided testing. It has provided tools. It has provided protocols. It has provided treatments. It has provided vaccines. Many people may not realize that this is the first time ever in the history of infectious disease that we are trying to control a pandemic with a vaccine. First time ever. So it's really very, very historic, and it has happened because of science. It has allowed people to collaborate and cooperate through open access and through open data. And just sharing information. Could you have imagined that a company like Merck would be making a vaccine for Johnson & Johnson? That's happening today. So it has had positives. But of course, the pandemic has been extremely disruptive for research because projects have stopped or projects have slowed down. It has especially been hard on early career researchers for the opportunities that they have. People who were hoping to transition from a postdoc into a faculty position, that has sort of been delayed. The networking opportunities, the career progression opportunities have been impacted. And most importantly, the mental health of researchers have been impacted. It has also led to cut in extramural funding for non-COVID research. So while government funding, and if you're talking about India, for example, DBT, for example, has put 900 crores towards vaccine R&D through BIRAC. But obviously, it's all come from the same pie. So the support for COVID research has slowed down. And if you actually go to the DBT site and look at the statistics they show on their website on the projects that DBT has sanctioned, and I will read it out to you. 2018-19, DBT sanctioned 847 projects. 2019-20, 594 projects. And 2020-21, 289 projects. So the number of projects have gone down quite substantially, but the funding outlay from DBT hasn't gone down. So obviously, a lot of work, a lot of money has gone to support work for COVID. So what have funders really done during this period? Well, one of the things that many funders have done internationally and also in India is to reduce the turnover time for a grant application from application to award. These times have been shortened. Funding agencies have also been very understanding in terms of giving extensions, although those are no-cost extensions. They have reduced the documentary requirements that are required for grants. So for example, I know that India Alliance did this, that instead of submitting hard copies of everything, of letters and everything, you can just submit emails or online copies. So all this has been done. But in the end, let me just chalk out 5 points. But before that, let me also say a little bit about India's science budget 21-22. The Ministry of Science and Technology has received about 20% increase in the budget. The other thing that has happened is that the National Research Foundation has been promised with an outlay of about 50,000 crores over the next 5 years. But national labs, their budget has actually gone down by about 5%. So it's really been a mixed bag. So let me come to the 5-point strategy on what to look forward for both funders as well as governments. First, I think we should be providing some ring-fenced funding towards a systemic change as we come out of COVID. Because COVID has shown the systemic gaps and where things have not worked well. We should also look at research investments in biomedicine, which includes One Health and ecology, because after all, infectious diseases are moving into humans from wild animal sources. And the other place to really invest is in digital technology, because digital technology is something that has really saved us a lot of trouble in these times. Point number 3 is to build partnerships, and partnerships that will take discovery to deployment. That's very, very important. We can't simply be satisfied with discovery. Discovery has to move forward. Point number 4, reform funding processes so that they are agile, they are responsive, and they can deal with surge capacity. And finally, point number 5 is to improve the sustainability of research ecosystems. So I will stop there and happy to answer any questions later.
Thank you, Shahid. So lucidly laid out point-wise. And I think, you know, I already see some comments coming in, and we will take questions later. But just wanted to point out that somebody already thanked you for acknowledging how hard this has been on the mental health of researchers. So thanks, Shahid, for that. There's an audience poll, and tell us whether the pandemic has had a negative effect, a positive effect, or no effect on your research funding over this past year. So I think in the interest of time, because we're running about 8 minutes late, we won't take any post-poll comments. We'll just take a bunch of questions that are coming in. Only 3%, 2 of our respondees say that they have had a positive effect on their research. 44%, 32 say that it has been negative. And so far, for most of them, luckily as YIs, there hasn't been an impact. So while Shahid did share with us, the DBT, for example, has literally given out about half the grants in this last financial year compared to the previous. Luckily for most of the YI attendees, for a majority of them at least, there has not been an impact, but a significant number have. And instead of weighing in on this right away, we'll discuss this more towards the end and speed up a little. So we now want to bring Sandhya in on how we have already and can continue to support the careers of early researchers, postdocs and PhD students that have been negatively affected at this time, their careers and their funding. Sandhya?
Yes, thank you, Rashna. I'm going to discuss this in the reverse order to what you said. I'm going to start by talking first about research students. Now, if there's one section of society that's been maximally affected by the COVID crisis, it has been the young, and the young in any country. Schools have closed, colleges have closed, universities have closed, students were asked to go back home during this period of time. And their motivation or their drive to continue in this particular profession is something that I think we need to keep boosting. And as Bushra very nicely said, the way to engage or the way to enthuse our students is to engage with them, encourage them, and also continuously stay in touch with them. Now, I know from my own experience that for the first 2 months after there was a shutdown, I was more worried, frankly, about the 500 odd mice that were in my colony and how they were going to be maintained than my half a dozen PhD students and postdoctoral fellows who must have been at home, perhaps enjoying their mother's cooking for a very long time, after a very long time. After a couple of months, I suddenly realized that one needed to keep engaged with them. One needed to keep talking to them. And so we began again our weekly meetings, discussions. There was a bit of RNA-seq data that could be analyzed and which got them to do some reading. I even encouraged many of them to write stuff down. Maybe you could start writing the introduction of your thesis because you know more or less what your work is going to involve. So for younger people, it's extremely important that this constant communication and discussion happens from their mentors. And this is something that I feel very important. From a practical level, one of the things that would cause students concern is the fact that their scholarships have a finite duration. It is for 5 years. Now, if something like 6 to 7 months or maybe even up to a year has been lost because of the pandemic, what happens to their scholarship? They were being paid scholarship during that 1 year. Now, one of the things that my institute has done is across the board extended the fellowship by 3 months for senior students, students in their 4th year and in their 5th year. Now, this definitely does not cover the shortfall, but at least it's a gesture to tell the students that institutes are aware of their difficulties and we'll try and see what best we can do to support them. Now let's come to postdocs. Now, postdocs perhaps are the most challenged individuals in the scientific profession. They have completed their PhD, they're not yet faculty, and they have to prove themselves in the period of 3, 4, 5, 6 years. And cutting down on their output has really been, has had a major impact on them. And I would say very categorically that I think the major impact has been had or felt by women postdoctoral fellows. Many of these postdoctoral fellows would have had young children who they used to feel assured to be able to keep in daycare centers during the time they were in the lab. All that has come to a standstill. And again, from personal experience, I have an outstanding postdoctoral fellow who became a mother last year. And for the last year, she's been trying to keep her research ticking along with the responsibilities of having to take on a young child. And I think perhaps one of the ways that institutions or organizations could help these postdocs is because they come, many of them, with their own independent fellowship. Can there be an across-the-board extension provided, for example, by the India Alliance for Early Career Fellows, by DBT for Ramlingaswamy or Ramling Fellowships, without the individual having to ask for it and justify it and provide 100 pages of document as to why there was a delay? Can this not just be something that is provided across the board for these young people? Finally, I'll come to the early career researchers. And I think their mentorship has a lot to play. Now, whether Bushra remembers or not, I do remember once visiting IIT Kanpur, and she organized a lab meeting while I was there, where each of her students presented their work. Again, it boils down to continuous engagement with somebody who cares about what you're doing and where your science is going. And I understand the issues of early career researchers who have just set up their labs. Most of them are on a tenure track policy. Now they're worried. 7, 8 months, 1 year of their tenure process has really yielded pretty much nothing except, taking care of mice perhaps. Here again, institutions can play an important role in reducing the stress level of these young investigators. How about across the board extending the tenure track period? We have done this in the Indian Institute of Science. All faculty on the tenure track process have been given another 6 months extension before they're asked to submit their papers for review. So these small little things will ease the stress that young investigators face and hopefully make them make them stay convinced that science is a worthwhile profession to stay in, rather than feel that this is a big headache and maybe I should just move into something else where I know I can be equally good. Thank you, Rashna.
Thank you, Sandhya. It is true, and I think, Sandhya, you have seen how being at a university, what kind of negative impact this has had, especially on young researchers, and your challenge to funding agencies of all sorts, all you from the PhD onwards, is to give everyone who's been affected just an extension. So let's see if that anyone meets your challenge. In the meantime, we have a poll for our audience. And have you had a positive, a negative, or no impact on your career progression? And we'll take that quickly from the audience. And as Sandhya had pointed out, and remember, we had YIs here at this meeting, no PhD students, and we didn't even get postdocs in at this time. So 73% of our YIs have felt that the pandemic has been negative for their career. 6 responded saying there's been a positive effect, and for 16, there's been no effect so far. So it doesn't really look good, does it? On that we've not been able to really reassure our young investigators that the negative impact is not permanent. And I hope we can do that, and all of us can get to do that. So we have more questions coming in, and we are running short on time. So we're going to take Ron next and get Ron, your perspective on what impact the pandemic has had on global scientific agendas. Do you think there have been more collaborations, and all of this in the near term is what has helped us deal with the pandemic? And is this kind of interaction going to continue in the long term? So has it really been a good thing that some of us feel it has? Ron?
Yes, well, anyway, thanks for the invitation and great to see everyone. I just want to comment on that striking poll that we just saw, which was, 73%. And, I want to acknowledge that, but I also want to provide like a note of optimism, so like at least attempt to do. I think we all have to recognize that this has been a year of, tremendous anxiety, but also I'll use the word uncertainty. And I think what that poll may also reflect is that element of uncertainty, which is affecting us all, that, we're looking ahead to the future and not understanding exactly what may happen. But I would underscore that in many cases, like your future may not be affected. And there may be, like, in a year from now, many good outcomes, but I think we also just have to reflect on the way that the uncertainties is kind of affecting our mood and mental state. But I do hope that 73% number, also will turn around over the next few months. It's definitely been a tough year for everyone. I mean, I left a job of 34 years in one location in San Francisco and started a new job as executive director at Janelia Research Campus a month before the pandemic. So I've been in charge of 700 people here, and I certainly kind of appreciate how that's affected everyone. We did increase the tenure clock, effectively the appointment clock for everyone here at Janelia by 1 year, referring to Sandhya's comments. And I think it was also important that even during the shutdown, everyone kept their jobs here. And I think that level of stability, has been really critical for the Institute. Anyway, going on to looking ahead, how will COVID-19 affect the scientific system? Well, here we can maybe turn to some, I would say, positive elements of how, what we're already seeing in COVID-19. And I'll try to be brief, but as I'm sure all of you are aware, I mean, COVID-19 has created this spirit of public sharing of data among scientists in a way to affect more collaboration, speed up research, and there's been an enormous boost in preprint sharing of research. And I hope that trend will continue. I mean, I think a trouble with the research community in recent years is to hold back on sharing data. There's been less communication of unpublished data at meetings. There's been more fear of sharing data due to some negative impact that will have on people's careers. I think there's been a strain for many young scientists, this worry about, can I share my data? Will this impact my future, et cetera, even though many young people actually do want to share their data and collaborate. And I think COVID-19 has kind of maybe stirred the pot on this, and we'll have to see how this continues, but I hope it will stir the pot in many positive directions for open science. And I would hope we don't slip back exactly to where we were in the past. The other thing I think, and this will be interesting to see how our community deals with this, but I think there's a realization that the world now is facing many global scientific problems. A pandemic is a perfect example of it. It's not the only example. It's like how we think about biodiversity. It's how we, think about climate change. It's how we think about infectious disease of various sorts. The planet right now is facing many global challenges, and we're even going to see this in the next year when we look at the vaccine rollout, the inequity of what will undoubtedly be an inequity of vaccine access. And I think this is going to potentially, affect us in just thinking about science as a global problem rather than, one institute at a time, one country at a time. And I don't, know where this is going to go, but I think this is something that COVID-19 is making us face, at least as a global scientific community. The other thing we've already talked about, it's already affecting YIM, but is virtual communication. And I think this is going to be, good for the globe and good for India, frankly. Just involvement in a lot of things like review panels or meetings. I'm sure Shahid can comment on that. Just the amount of travel that we had to do and carbon footprint for short meetings. We're never going to go back to that, I don't think. Traveling, and it made it virtually impossible for people in India to travel like 30 hours to a one-day meeting in Washington, D.C., for example. But I think with virtual communication, that's now possible. I think it makes it possible to have more global representation in scientific decision-making, which I think will be very exciting. Public perception of science, I think that was discussed by several people. I hope this COVID-19 will be a turning point. In fact, I was convinced that it would be early on when there was the realization that the way out of this is through science. I've been very disappointed on how that played out in the United States so far. And so I don't think it's a given, but I think it's an opportunity for the scientific community to rally around that message, not assume that it's going to be automatically appreciated, but I think it's something that we shouldn't let our guard down and keep the momentum up in how we engage the public with the reality that science is actually needed for things that affect people's lives. So I think that's the main things I want to say. I think it would be interesting for YIM and the PDF meeting, and maybe I will say this, and even recruiting for India, to think of ways in which virtual communication can, improve the situation in India. Even for recruiting, a traditional method of sending emails individually to different institutes, having someone hopefully respond, having someone like travel around the world to meet people at institutes. I think COVID-19 is offering up new opportunities for connectivity of the, Indian diaspora, if you like, in ways that may be really helpful to building scientific infrastructure in India as well.
Thanks, Ron. I think you put across some really good points. And the point about openness and sharing, suddenly all of us learning to accept, that preprints are the place to go because we're so hungry for good news on the pandemic. And now it's just suddenly become acceptable, whereas earlier people were holding back. And the point about reducing the carbon footprint, I think, is just very true. And there's no going back on traveling all over just for one-day meetings. Although we do believe that we would like to hold physical meeting for YIMS because the networking there and the personal touch is important. So there's an audience poll on whether we feel, what do you feel, whether there's going to be an overall negative or in the long term a global positive impact the pandemic has had or there will be no lasting impact, you think? And we'll all just forget about it as soon as all of us have had our vaccination and are no longer fearful. So let's see what the audience has to say. And I think most 42 out of every one poll, that's 48%, do believe that in the long term, there's going to be a positive impact on the way we do our research. Unfortunately, 22% feel that the negative impact they are facing right now, remember about 70-odd% had a negative effect on their careers. They are fearful that this will continue. Although some are more cynical and think that there's going to be no impact whatsoever in the long run. So we've had our polls, and we've had all our speakers, panelists say what it is that they, we'd ask them to weigh in upon. And I think it's high time we now open this up, because we've got about 15 minutes or maybe less to take questions. I'll read out some of the questions we've got, and then we'll have some people unmute and ask questions. Lasya Samhita is concerned that with the delay that the pandemic has caused and the break it has in our research careers, it's going to now take longer for young researchers to build that strong CV publication-wise that they need to, to move on in their careers, let's say the tenure track position, or even get hired. And especially in terms of hiring, Lasya is worried about the 35-year age barrier that seems to be all pervasive in Indian science. So Jitu, since you've been involved in a lot of recruiting at the NCBS, would you like to weigh in on whether you think this is going to be a problem for young researchers, and can we extend that age barrier? And don't just talk about NCBS here, give us your perspective on Indian hiring.
Yeah, no, I think Lasya is raising very pertinent points. I won't talk about NCBS because, we have been trying to do something about this, but I think the system at large in India has to take this on account. And I mean, expressing a view like this here should not be just from one individual. And I think we must have collective action, and maybe one can use the platform of India Bioscience here to put across some of these concerns. I mean, at the end of the day, whether we like it or not in the biological sciences, we do take much longer to get to the stage of having a presentable portfolio for getting a job, and I think that's something that as life science researchers we must acknowledge, and we must persuade our community that is involved in hiring that these age restrictions should be modified, at least to take account for the next 5 years for people who have been affected, who are joining, say, in this period. I'm completely convinced that we must make a collective effort here.
Yeah, so Jitu, as you know, we've already been putting this across on behalf of the young investigators. At the 10th YIM, we got all these kinds of inputs and have put them across to the community, the policy makers and the decision takers. And some of these things are starting to come through. I have heard that the CSIR is going to raise the age limit for women candidates. I haven't heard the same about men. But again, I think if we talk about these things enough, they will happen. So thank you, Lasya. And Arshdeep Sidhu has a question that we can handle live. So would you like to unmute yourself, Arshdeep, and ask the question?
Yeah, hi, Rashna. Can you hear me?
Yes, Arshdeep, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, everyone. I would like to ask the panelists, what are the long-term implications for the young investigators regarding the freeze in the fundamental research that we saw last year? And when can we expect this to come to a new normal, and what might it look like? Thank you.
So Shahid, do you feel there has been a freeze in fundamental research funding, and if this is ever going to be back reset?
But at least the numbers that are available to me from public sources suggest that the number of grants that are awarded by DBT, which is the largest funder for life sciences research in India, between 2018 and 19 to now, it has gone down to 33%, 3 times fall. So yes, this has impacted, but one hopes that with the increased funding for the science departments that has come through in this year's budget, and with the National Research Foundation money coming in, there would be some corrective measures and some improvements in the coming years. This will be a slow recovery. This is like the pandemic curve. It rises very quickly, but it takes an awful long time to fall back to baseline. So my fear is that this is going to happen. But yes, the positive point is that the value of science has been established, and it's not just government funding. Many high net individuals are also now looking to put their money into science. So don't just look at government funding, find innovative ways to fund your science.
All right, so Shahid is talking about the future, which we hope will be here in the not so very distant future, where we do have private funding. Till then, we rely on the bread and butter, 50, 80 lakh DBT grants to keep our labs running, and hopefully, on a positive viewpoint, I think the impact of fundamental research on how it has helped us deal with the pandemic and is going to be recognized by funding agencies, and they're not going to expect us to change priorities. But Ron, would you like to comment on this? There is a concern that both hiring and funding for young investigators is going to shift into translational drug development deliverables mode, both hiring and funding. And is this concern well-founded? Or are we going to be able to convince hirers and funders to continue to fund blue sky fundamental research? Ron?
I haven't seen any clear evidence of this. I mean, I can understand, again, why this can be a worry or concern, and so forth. But from what I see, it actually has not played out in that way, at least in the United States. I can't comment on what's happening in India. So, I still think, at least here, the scientific community in the NIH and a lot of foundations, I think, as Shahid said also, private foundations are going to play a big role, but I still think that those funding agencies recognize the value of fundamental basic research, and I don't see that as changing. I mean, some people have been worried over the last 10 years that the NIH overall has shifted, not due to COVID-19, but in general, more into a translational space or big project space, that has translational implications. Perhaps that is true to some extent, but if you really look at the funding, there's still, I would say, a large base of funding for basic science research. That said, and this goes back to my other comment of how we communicate to the public, if we as a scientific community fail to communicate well, the premise and the foundation of basic science research, or we just assume that people know about this, that has been a threat for basic science for many years before COVID-19. And I think it's partly incumbent upon us as the scientific community, COVID-19 or not, to communicate that message well.
So Rashna, if I may add, I think Ron has a wonderful point at the end. And, instead of worrying about it, whether, fundamental science is going to be valued in future or not, let's also take it upon ourselves to inform the taxpayer who funds our science that science is valuable. And for that, I would really highlight to all the young investigators that if there is one soft skill that you need to develop, that is to communicate better. You may be the world's best scientist, but if you're not able to communicate well, then there's something lacking. So develop that skill. That's very important.
Yeah, absolutely, Shahid. I think one thing, the positive again coming out of this has been that people like you and many others have been able to reach out to the public, and the public has accepted sort of, looked to the scientific community to solve this problem, and we have delivered to quite an extent. So that, I think now if we, and as you said, we all are accountable to our funding bodies who ultimately are the taxpayer, and we need to use that in a positive manner to explain why it is that we need to fund the kind of research we do. Jitu, I believe you raised your hand. Would you like to weigh in on this discussion?
I want to make a small point. I think fundamental research, as as we perceive it, is not unmoored. Meaning, it is based in some questions that are raised and are raised, at least in our own radar. Now, I think if we could, find these questions which are coming from our own context, whether it's a global problem which can be thought of in a local way, I think the chances of being able to connect to connect this effective communication that Shahid and Rana both talking about is going to be higher, and the ability for us to then leverage that for supporting fundamental research will also be higher. So, I feel, we should be beginning to do that as a community as well. I mean, not everyone, but as a community, we should be able to move in that direction. So fundamental research, which is, it is connected to the scope of, being able to translate something to the community at large is made a central focus of translation. Fundamental research is that and should continue to be that, but people have to see that, and that's crucial.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we are running out of time any moment now. But there was something that Sandhya wanted to say, and then we'll just give all of you a minute to wrap up on a positive note, hopefully, and then we can move on to the next session. So you keep the audience polls in mind and just wrap up in about 30 seconds and speak to our young investigators on how they should look ahead, assuming the pandemic is going to be behind us very shortly. Sandhya?
I think this question that I thought I could take on from is this issue related to basic science and possibly what you want to call applied science. And I'd like to direct the audience to an article that caught my attention on the November 19th issue of Nature. And this has been written by Dr. Francine Ntumi, who happens to be the head of the Medical Research Council in Congo. And she comments on the kind of attention that COVID-19 has received over the past year. And in a way, she wonders why such attention has not been paid to other tropical diseases like malaria or tuberculosis. She bemoans the fact that in places like Uganda, testing for HIV has plummeted by almost 75%. Now, the implications of that at a societal level are really huge. She says, what if the world had tackled malaria with the energy now dedicated to the coronavirus? Now, for those of us in countries like India, perhaps Asia, perhaps sub-Saharan Africa, we may want to do a little soul searching as to what it is that made us rally around so much and to think about COVID-19 and invest so much time and resources and our energies in attacking something that perhaps has not had the devastating impact in this region as it has had perhaps in the Northern Hemisphere. Now, as far as young investigators are concerned, they must do the research that excites them. You'll never be successful trying to mold your research direction to suit a funding agency or to suit a particular problem because you think the money is there. In the long term, it won't work and it won't give you the excitement and the enthusiasm to continue going to the lab against all odds. I would tend to agree with Ron, and I certainly hope that basic science is not neglected. Convincing the Indian populace of the value of basic science is not easy because you have to convince the politicians that basic science is important because they're the ones that dole out the funds to these government agencies. And I think it's going to be a big challenge, and it has always been a challenge in India to convince politicians and the public that discovering CRISPR and Cas is as exciting as finding a vaccine for COVID-19. Thank you, Rashna.
Thank you, Sandhya. Shahid, your last few wrap-up words, about 30 seconds.
Yeah, so I look at the future with optimism for a couple of reasons. One is that, of course, the politicians, the policymakers that Sandhya was talking about have also seen the value of science, and they have seen the value of investing in health, and hopefully health will become a political agenda. The other point that I'm optimistic about is that all of you DBT-funded institutions who largely do fundamental research have come together to carry out 2.8 million COVID tests during the past year. These are people who were not virologists. These were people who were not doing diagnostic tests. These were basic bench scientists. So you have enormous amounts of plasticity, enormous amounts of lateral thinking ability. Believe in yourself, and I think the future will be fine. Let's not worry too much about it.
Right, Shahid. Do what you can, and I think that's a mantra many of us were able to follow. Let's do something, and all those tests that you were talking about, Shahid, I think they have made us feel at least that we've had some impact. And going forward, things are going to only change for the better, and a lot of the positives have been covered in this panel. So Jitu, do you want to continue on that positive note and give us your closing comments?
Well, I just want to add one thing to Shahid's comments, that we also had a lot of PCR machines. so remember that investments were realized. And I think that's the point, that science is an investment. And it's an investment in today, and it's also an investment in tomorrow. And I think we need to have governments that think in this way. And as if Shahid feels that politicians today have realized the importance of science, I think it's really very, very encouraging. But I think that remains to be seen once the specter of COVID-19 lifts and people begin to think that life is back to normal. And I feel as scientists, we must continue to claim that exciting science, as Sandhya says, is really what's going to bring us the fruits for tomorrow, right? So I'll stop there. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jitu. So Ron, you get the last word in on the panel, and give us your thoughts on continue on the positive note. Thanks, Ron. Go ahead.
Okay, well, on the positive note, I mean, I think this is a message to the early career researchers here. I mean, first of all, to support each other. I think this is really important. I mean, you saw in this poll, 73% have concerns, and whether they're true or not, whether it's going to come true or not, doesn't matter. The concerns are there, and I think it's really important to know that you're not alone. Even seeing that statistic is probably very powerful for many people on this panel. And I think supporting one another as in your institute, as a community, also sticking together as early career researchers, really important. You know, the other thing is, and I, you know, used to start and end the YIM meeting talking about early career researchers as leaders and leaders of a future that you want to create. And I think a lot of what YIM is about, you know, your agency, your leadership, your voice, your agency in also affecting the future that you want to create. I think COVID-19, there's some opportunities here to do that. It's opening up some doors if I think the community seizes it. 35-year-old age limit, I mean, quite honestly, this seems arcane. And I think, you know, COVID-19 may be a window that shines on that. And I think also opportunities, you know, for other potential changes in Indian science. I mentioned how one communicates. So I think there are opportunities here and you know, of affecting change. And, you know, YIM has always been a venue for discussing these kinds of things. And I think it's also great that the, you know, young investigators can be part of that. But I would just say there are some opportunities here that could be really positive with this particular moment. And I would just say, don't lose it if there are some good things that could be created out of this.
Thank you, Ron. And thanks to all the panelists. There are good things ahead, and there are new good things that will be created out of the not good thing that happened to all of us. So thank you all. And I think I hand over now to Shantala to take you forward and explain to our attendees how the breakouts will work. Thank you. And thanks especially to Jitu for filling in at the very last minute. Bye. Bye, everyone.